This anime is set in a world where magic is everything. At Garden Magic Academy, a student named Will lacks the magical talent necessary to survive. To stay at the academy, he must embark on a difficult journey, defeating monsters in the dungeon. Despite his lack of magic, Will believes he can still grow. However, in class, he is constantly belittled by both teachers and classmates. When Professor Edward calls on him, he becomes the laughingstock of the class because he cannot perform even the most basic magic, while his peers accomplish it effortlessly. After school, Will intended to go to the dungeon again, but Scion intercepted him just to break his spirit and humiliate him. Luckily, there was a girl who often defended Will. When Will was insulted, Colette immediately stood up for him by mentioning his strengths. The reason Will never fought back was that he realized he was indeed incapable of magic. Instead, he felt lucky to have a cute girl like Colette who cared for him. When Will complimented her, Colette became flustered. She felt like she was being hit on, even though Will had no ulterior motive. While gazing at the sky, Will was reminded of the world's history. Long ago, people lived in fear of space invaders. 5 great sorcerers then rose up to confront them and created a barrier in the vast sky. Magia Vander is the title of the most powerful sorcerer, a title that is still passed down to this day. Elfaria is one of the people who received this title. She is Will's childhood friend and also the youngest and most talented Magia Vander. Will and Elfaria once promised to become Magia Vander together. To fulfill that promise, Will still fights desperately because he doesn't have the same talent as Elfaria. One time, Will secretly entered the dungeon, and of course Mr. Werkner scolded him because it was a dangerous thing to do. Even so, the proof of the defeated monster was accepted, and Will was entitled to 2 credits. Credits were one of the requirements to graduate from the academy. However, his credits were still insufficient, and in the final exam, Will had to get 4 more credits to be able to continue studying at this academy. When Mr. Werkner gave information about the monster worth 4 credits, Scion secretly listened to their conversation and intended to defeat the monster first so that Will would be expelled from the academy for lack of credits. However, as soon as Scion and his friends started entering the dungeon, one of his friends was suddenly attacked by a monster. Hearing their voices, Will, who was resting, immediately approached to check on them. Upon closer inspection, Will found Scion helpless. Because Scion had often belittled him, Will momentarily thought that the guy didn't deserve to be helped. But for the sake of becoming someone worthy to stand beside Elfaria, he decided to fight regardless of his personal issues. At the same time, Professor Edward informed Werkner that Scion had entered the dungeon without permission. Since Scion had entered the same dungeon as Will, Mr. Werkner said there was no need to worry because Will was also there. Even though he didn't have a magical talent, Will's swordsmanship skills were no less impressive than a sorcerer. He has the ability to remember his opponent's movement patterns, allowing him to dodge and counterattack at the right time. According to Mr. Werkner, in this world of magic, Will is the only swordsman whose sword strikes can rival lightning. 5 years ago, all the students mocked Will because they found out he couldn't use magic. All this time, he was just used as bait to get Elfaria into the Magic Academy. But since Elfaria had become a Magia Vander, Will's presence was no longer needed. However, when the headmaster tested his abilities, it turned out that Will had incredible reflexes. He was able to deflect magical attacks using only his sword. Because of that, the headmaster allowed him to continue his education there. During Mr. Werkner's class, he explained how to ascend to the highest institution. To become a Magia Vander, ruling from the tower's peak, one must be recognized as the best in the higher institution. There are 2 ways to get in, by creating a new spell or by earning as many credits as possible at the academy. However, Mr. Werkner emphasized that they were all far from reaching the higher institution. They were struggling to even graduate. As Will and Colette walked down the hallway, they saw a group of students praising Scion for successfully defeating a monster worth 10 credits. However, Scion was not happy with the praise because the one who actually defeated the monster was Will. On the other hand, Professor Edward made a request to the headmaster to expel Will immediately, stating that he refused to acknowledge a figure who surpassed wizards without having magic. The headmaster couldn't accept the request because Will was an ideal model student if they ignored his lack of magic. However, because Professor Edward insisted on expelling him, the headmaster allowed a test to be conducted, and if Will failed, the professor would have the authority to expel him. Meanwhile, Will, who was studying about other races in the library, was studying diligently even though Colette reminded him not to push himself. He continued to study because he admired the dwarf's perseverance. Soon after, Professor Edward took him to the magic practice hall, where Edward would give him remedial lessons and assess his capacity unilaterally in this test. Will was only given the task of delivering a single attack on Professor Edward. On the other hand, Mr. Werkner was informed by the headmaster that Edward was testing Will, and he was forbidden to interfere. According to Werkner, this action was too cruel, as Edward was once the best Magia Vander candidate who had reached the peak of the tower. Despite the vast difference in their strength, Will still tried his best to endure. They launched an attack on Edward, who had a solid defense, but no matter how hard Will tried, he couldn't match his magical abilities. At the same time, Kiki, Will's pet, tried to fetch a sword for his master. Noticing this, Colette immediately opened the locker and handed the sword to Will, who was already beaten up. Will declared that no matter what happened, he wanted to reach the position of Magia Vander, the reason being that he wanted to keep his promise to Elfaria to watch the sunrise from the top of the tower. Hearing such a ridiculous reason, Mr. Edward became frustrated and even more determined to expel him. But when Will used the sword, he proved that his swordsmanship could match magic. Unexpectedly, Will was able to penetrate Edward's defense and successfully landed an attack on Edward. Before parting ways with Elfaria, Will promised her that he would also go to the top of the tower. Despite the great obstacles separating them, Will would definitely follow her. Hearing that, Elfaria said she would always wait for him. Will was an independent child. Every morning, he would deliver newspapers from house to house. Among the newspapers he delivered, it was reported that Elfaria had successfully created a new spell. In addition, the higher institution also gave a mission to everyone in the Magic Academy, and their client was Elfaria herself. Hearing the news, Will was excited to join the mission. He quickly prepared himself to enter the dungeon, to search for the Frostwalker's core. When he arrived at the dungeon, Will found the place crowded with other students. Before the monsters were all gone, Will decided to explore deeper. Then when he reached the lower floor, Will met a girl in danger. Without hesitation, Will immediately rescued her and defeated all the monsters surrounding her. Meanwhile, at the academy, students who were not on the mission continued their regular studies. At that time, Mr. Werkner was explaining about spells named after their original creators. In the middle of the lesson, a student asked if Miss Elfaria, who was in the news this morning, was considered a great person. Then Mr. Werkner said she was incredibly great, so great it was hard to believe. Elfaria could be called the greatest sorceress in history. She had created 12 original spells that had never existed before. The girl whom Will rescued was named Iris. She called Will Senpai because she was 2 years younger than him. Unlike other students who looked down on him, Iris deeply respected Will. According to her, even though he couldn't use magic, Will still had incredible abilities. While exploring the dungeon, Iris mentioned that she had actually met Elfaria before. She had once been saved by her when she was surrounded by many monsters in the dungeon. Therefore, to dedicate herself to Elfaria, she was ready to carry out her mission. However, since coming to the dungeon, she hadn't found the Frostwalker. Moreover, her search magic hadn't yielded any results. Will reasoned that the Frostwalker always left ice dust behind as it moved. Because there was a lot of dust in this area, he assumed there was a large monster ahead. Upon closer inspection, his assumption was correct. There was a giant monster there called the Frost Rex. Iris warned Will against fighting it, saying that the Frost Rex was immune to physical attacks and could only be defeated with magic. Despite being warned, Will still decided to fight it. He felt confident that he could defeat it because he had defeated that kind of monster several times before. When fighting the Frost Rex, Will didn't use his sword this time. Instead, he used ropes and explosives, tying them all over the monster's body. Then, when everything was tied up, he lit the end of the rope to trigger a big explosion. With that, the Frost Rex was defeated. Iris was not an ordinary student. She was a spy who monitored the students to report back to the Magia Vander. Based on her observations, Iris recommended Will to work at the tower. However, there were some people who opposed it, so they would wait for the results of the magic festival before making a decision. Out of the 12,000 credits available in the academy, students were required to collect 7,200 credits in the final exam. Xian and Colette had already met their target, while Will was still below the target, because he often failed practical exams. Besides them, there were several very promising students, Lindor Wignall and Julius Reinbert. They were top students with over 10,000 credits. The number of credits could be used as an indicator of a student's ability. Therefore, let alone entering the higher institution, Will felt that his credits were still insufficient to graduate from this academy. During break time, Colette told Will that he had to perform well at the Magic Festival because written exams alone wouldn't be enough to get into the higher institution. Besides, the school festival was also a way to climb the tower, even if the credits weren't enough. The Grand Magic Festival was a big event at the Magic Academy, held every 2 years. The festival featured many magic competitions and was often used by senior wizards to find promising talents. However, Will wasn't interested in participating. He would just help prepare for the festival. He thought his presence might cause trouble, and he would be blamed for any problems. Meanwhile, outside, the students were practicing their magic creations, adding to the festive atmosphere. While in the storage room, Colette sensed a kind of barrier hidden in front of the locker. When it was forcibly opened, there was a secret staircase behind the locker that led to the basement. In the basement, there was a group of students holding a secret gambling session. They had gathered to place bets on who would win the Grand Festival. After school, Colette wanted to accompany Will on his exploration of the dungeon. However, Will wouldn't be going to the dungeon today because he had to work at the shop. While Will was working, a customer named Mr. Donnan complimented his spirit. Tonight, his dorm mate, Rosti, also worked at the shop. Although she was new to the job, Rosti was able to perform her tasks better than Will. Meanwhile, Will seemed to be struggling because he was often engaged in conversations with customers. Even though the pay was low, Will still enjoyed working there. He felt very valued because they welcomed him warmly. Soon, Julius and his friends came to the shop. Upon arriving, they immediately insulted the shop just because it was full of dwarves. They belittled all the customers and mocked the food that was served. Will couldn't accept that. He told them to apologize for insulting the people he respected. Julius and his friends refused to comply, and because Will was already emotional, he started confronting them with violence. Feeling challenged, Julius immediately retaliated, freezing the entire room and attacking Will with his magic. In addition, Julius also challenged Will to participate in the festival with the intention of humiliating him in front of many people. A few days later, the Grand Magic Festival officially opened. In the dragon racing competition, Liana won first place and became the champion. Meanwhile, in the Crown War competition, Sion received an invitation from Colette to join her team. Initially, Sion thought that Colette preferred him over Will. However, it turned out that she had invited him to her team just to fulfill her credit accumulation requirements. Sion was very upset about this, and he was also annoyed that Will seemed to be ignoring him. Soon after, the fairies started preparing the arena for the Crown War competition. In this competition, participants had to overcome various obstacles in each zone prepared by the fairies. Each team would be placed outside the zone and race to reach the main stadium. The winning condition was to obtain the crown located inside the stadium. Additionally, each team was allowed to hinder other teams, making the competition more difficult. When the host introduced each participant, the audience immediately laughed because Will was also participating, especially since Sion was on the same team as him. The participants immediately entered the first zone and had to face a magical golem that blocked their path. Because he couldn't use magic, people thought Will wouldn't be able to do anything. However, he was actually the first one to break through the golem's defense. Using the magic gloves provided by Colette, Will could strike every enemy without breaking the rules. With this, Will and his team led the front line. No trap or obstacle could stop him, so they continued to advance towards the stadium. With his swordsmanship skills, the barren land zone seemed easy for him to pass through, while the other teams started to have difficulties. Many participants had already been eliminated and couldn't continue the competition. Meanwhile, Julius and his team from Group 9 were still walking leisurely. They didn't seem bothered that Will had already surpassed them. When Will and his team reached the forest zone, they found themselves surrounded by a chain of magic traps. To overcome them, Will simply needed to change his direction so that the traps would destroy themselves. Next, Will had to outpace the other teams and find an ambush point. However, it seemed that he had to change his plan because Julius had already gotten ahead of him. In that situation, Sion suddenly launched a fire spell forward. With full of anger, Sion ordered Julius not to interfere and challenged Will to a fight. Will was confused by Sion's actions. He was suddenly angry at him and ignored the competition. Colette tried to stop him, but Julius blocked her with a large chunk of ice. Initially, Scion saw Will as a pathetic kid, so Scion wanted to help him a little by making him his partner. But Will ignored him, which made Scion very angry and resentful. In the middle of the race, a split occurred in Team 6. Scion attacked Will relentlessly and hoped that Will would retaliate. However, even though he was attacked repeatedly, Will never retaliated. He tried to calm Scion down and get him to focus on the race again, but Scion wouldn't listen. People were disappointed by their split. Although Scion had a good credit score, he was considered a problematic student, so his reputation declined. At the same time, Iris and Rosti were supporting Will in the stands. In front of Rosti, Iris admitted that she knew Will and that she now admired him greatly. Meanwhile, in the race zone, Colette was being chased by Julius, who at that time, Colette hadn't had the chance to fight back and could only run away from him. In the midst of the competition, the audience was confused by Julius's presence everywhere. At that moment, he was facing all the teams simultaneously. With such great magic, the audience thought Julius would be the winner. Meanwhile, Team 6 was falling behind because of Scion's troublemaking. Even Scion's own teammates thought his actions were excessive. As time went on, the attacks launched by Scion became more intense. He had released the Fire Eagle spell to attack from 2 directions. With his gloves and sword strikes, Will was able to parry the attacks, but it wasn't enough to satisfy Scion. Scion's abilities had caught the attention of the observers. They considered his skills to be extraordinary and had surpassed the level of a student. Although his position was not yet equal to the top 3 students, talent scouts from the Fire faction began to consider recruiting him. Loudly, Scion asked Will if he didn't hate him after everything he had done. Will affirmed that he hated Scion and wanted to get revenge, but Will didn't have time to do so. Then Scion revealed that he didn't want to be ignored by him. Hearing this, Will realized that all this time, Scion had wanted to be acknowledged by him, and finally, Will decided to fight him. In the middle of the fight, Colette suddenly came to separate them. Colette asked Will to leave first and finish his business with Julius. While everyone else was busy watching the festival, Elfaria was sitting comfortably near the window. Then her aide came to wake her up to give her a document of candidates from the talent scouts. Among the participants, there was one candidate who seemed perfect for the Ice faction. Julius was considered a suitable candidate to be his successor. Meanwhile, Will, who was facing Julius, stated that he would not give up until they apologized. Hearing those words, Julius immediately used his magic and prepared to attack. In the fog created by Julius, Will was attacked from all directions. He felt surrounded even though his enemy's position hadn't changed. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that Julius was using a spell called Ars Vice, one of the spells created by Elfaria to create ice clones. Will wondered why he could use Elfaria's magic. Laughing at him, Julius said it was all thanks to his own talent, claiming to have mastered this spell himself, and that he was already as skilled as a Magia Vander. Although he could only use one of Elfaria's spells, it made Will unable to think clearly. He suddenly rushed forward without a plan, giving Julius a chance to corner him. Trapped within the ice enclosure, Will was struck by a massive chunk of ice. Believing he had won, Julius declared in front of the audience that he would become Elfaria's successor. However, to his surprise, Will was still standing after the attack. Now Will could face him calmly, having overcome his habit of getting emotional when discussing Elfaria. As Julius launched another attack, Will seized the opportunity to hide and attack Julius's teammates from behind. Without his team members, Julius couldn't maintain his ice clones. Thus, Will could confirm that Julius hadn't fully mastered Elfaria's magic. At the same time, Elfaria told Sarisa that she didn't want a successor. She only wanted a swordsman who could accompany her. After her secret was revealed, Julius tried to cover it up by creating more ice clones. Although he couldn't control them, he could hide among the clones so his position wouldn't be known. However, Will could find him easily. He understood the strengths and weaknesses of that magic better because he had seen it often when he was with Elfaria. Although Will admitted that Julius was indeed a great person, he still believed that Elfaria was superior because she created the magic when she was only 2 years old. Hearing the fact, Julius felt ashamed and frustrated. To cover up his embarrassment, he showed that he could create 8 clones. But it was still not as good as Elfaria because Will had always been oppressed by Elfaria's 10 shadows. After that, Will slashed one by one of his clones, then knocked Julius unconscious. With this, Will succeeded in fulfilling his promise. At the moment when everyone thought Will would win the tournament, suddenly Wignall took the crown first and became the winner of the tournament. Besides that, Elfaria was also embarrassed because her past was known to everyone. To celebrate Will's victory, the dwarves held a party at the shop. Meanwhile, Julius and his friends were made to wash the dishes as the dwarves only accepted an apology for their actions. Soon, the grand exploration would begin, a week-long dungeon exploration activity. To participate, each student had to form a team with several people. When Will was walking in the hallway, a group of students invited him to join their team after seeing his abilities during the festival. Now everyone stopped underestimating him and needed him for the dungeon exploration. Because they had often belittled Will, Colette couldn't let them, and she forbade them from inviting him, saying that Will had promised to accompany her. The next night, Rosti asked Will if he was going to the dungeon again tomorrow. When Will replied that he was going shopping with Colette, Rosti became curious and insisted on joining them. Colette was really hoping that this meeting would be a date. She wanted to spend the whole day with Will. But soon after they met, Rosti suddenly caught up with them, and it seemed that Will and Rosti were closer than just friends. Moreover, every time Colette tried to approach Will, Rosti always got there first, as if he wanted to separate them. Colette suspected their unusual closeness and questioned whether Rosti was just his roommate. While Rosti went to buy drinks, Colette told Will to go ahead and polish his sword. As soon as Will left, Colette directly asked Rosti if she considered Will more than a friend. Loudly, Rosti said that he was the person closest to Will. Those words, of course, made Colette angry, so they ended up arguing. Meanwhile, Will, who was going to the weapon shop, was approached by Liana. Without hesitation, Liana asked Will to come with her because there was something she needed to discuss. Then when they entered a room, Will was introduced to other talented students, including Sion and Julius. When Liana said that she wanted to form a team with Will, Sion and Julius immediately rejected her. They didn't want to be on the same team as Will because they thought he would be a burden. Luckily, there was someone who thought rationally, Wignall, who argued that even though Will's methods were not elegant, the fact was that he could defeat their magic. Besides that, Wignall also wanted to respect Liana's decision, considering her higher position than all of them. Liana wanted to use their help to achieve the best position when climbing the tower. She asked them to join her if this offer was beneficial. After that, they realized that there was no better team composition than this one. In the end, they decided to form a team with Liana. When exploring, Colette joined Liana's team because she felt like a package deal with Will. In this activity, Will had to achieve satisfactory results so that he could quickly catch up with Elfaria. But before he could do anything, he became a burden because his teammates were very strong. He didn't have a chance to attack or protect his teammates. Moreover, he couldn't predict the direction of the monster's appearance because his perception wasn't as wide as their search magic. While others were defeating monsters with a single attack, Will just stood there and couldn't do anything. This made Wignall think that Will was quite a burden because he couldn't protect them. Wignall expressed that he was starting to doubt Liana's judgment. However, Liana explained that Will just hadn't had a chance yet. She thought Will's abilities might show when facing a stronger enemy. Even so, they still underestimated him and often insulted Will along the way. One day passed since the grand exploration began. Liana reminded everyone that it was time to rest. To prevent any monsters from approaching them, Wignall then created a fire fortress using illusion magic. Then, Will distributed food to all the members. When giving it to Wignall, Wignall told him to put the food on the ground because he didn't want to touch someone he didn't acknowledge. Colette was angered by his arrogant attitude, but Will wasn't offended because he thought that elves had their own culture. Then, Liana explained that their goal was to defeat Nabarus, a 110-credit monster and the guardian of the 10th stratum of the dungeon. Liana wanted to show the tower that they could defeat the monster. To reach the 10th stratum, they took the shortest route, but when they arrived at Nabarus' location, they found that the monster had already been defeated. Feeling something was amiss, Liana immediately ordered her team to use the search magic. The magic was indeed very useful, but couldn't detect traps. At that moment, Will used his perception ability. Thanks to Will's warning, they were able to avoid the attack of monsters hiding above them. However, the monsters' movements were difficult to predict, resulting in Wignall being attacked, and they all fell deeper. The situation caused them to panic. They were separated from the other members and trapped in a dangerous zone. If their team didn't regroup soon, they could be killed in this dungeon. Meanwhile, Will remained calm and accompanied Wignall. He helped the injured Wignall, even though he was often belittled by him. While exploring the dungeon, several monsters approached them. Thanks to his knowledge and experience, Will could easily defeat them, while Wignall struggled because he was too panicked when fighting them. In a panic, Wignall said that he was just a failed elf. He was the only remaining elf in the academy, while the others had already ascended to the tower. Because he couldn't master the fantasy magic of the elves, Wignall was often considered talentless and a disgrace by the elves. As Liana said, the academy now only contained the remnants or the left behind. Talented individuals could directly ascend to the tower without having to graduate from the academy. For the past 6 years, Liana had only been able to watch them leave. Meanwhile, Wignall realized his shortcomings by seeing his adopted sister's greatness. She was the most powerful princess and the pride of the elves. Initially, Wignall wanted to always help her because she seemed so small. However, it turned out that she was an ancient elf who could create a giant sacred tree. Since his sister became a Magia Vander, Wignall had been striving to reach the same level, but he had never been able to achieve it. Hearing that, Will felt that he was similar to Wignall, and therefore, Will would protect him until he could rise again. Soon after, they arrived at a place filled with dangerous monsters. Although surrounded by monsters, Will could defeat them in an instant as if he were fighting weak monsters. But a moment after defeating the monsters, they heard a strange noise. Upon checking, it turned out that the dungeon around them was creating new monsters. The dungeon was producing monsters called Balkar. Besides having a fire body that was immune to physical attacks, the monster also had magic resistance, making it considered dangerous by the tower. The only way to defeat Balkar was by using elf fantasy magic. Will couldn't defeat it alone, he needed Wignall's help with his magic. Because his fantasy magic was still imperfect, Wignall felt incapable of helping him. However, Will still believed in him because they shared the same dream. Wignall didn't want to betray Will's trust, even though he was considered a disgrace by his race. He decided to rise up and try his magic again with strong determination. Finally, he managed to cast the elf fantasy magic, and with that magic, all the monsters could be defeated with one attack. Since then, Wignall acknowledged that Will was a swordsman worthy of respect. Meanwhile, Scion and Julius were arguing, always bickering over trivial matters and constantly belittling each other's abilities. Noticing an anomaly around the dungeon, Sensei Edward immediately canceled the exploration. Together with Mr. Werkner, they would evacuate all students. Liana apologized to Colette for dragging her into this situation, but Colette didn't blame her because it was her own fault for joining the team. Will had just met Scion and Julius. Although they didn't get along, they could cooperate when facing monsters. Meanwhile, Colette and Liana met a wizard, but it seemed like the person was a villain who had planned this chaos. They suddenly attacked Colette and Liana. When the enemies attacked, Will came to fend off their attacks. Thanks to Kiki's keen sense of smell and the crystal dropped by Colette, Will could find Colette so their team could reunite. Then, using teleportation magic, they summoned monsters to the place. However, the monsters summoned by the enemy were not ordinary monsters. They were evil Grand Dukes, high-level evil monsters that inhabited the 25th stratum. The power of their attacks was so overwhelming that they couldn't do anything but retreat to a safe route. However, even though they had hidden, the enemy commanded the other monsters to find them. Julius was desperate and the others were exhausted. Desperation began to break their spirits. Unlike his friends, Will still wanted to fight. He believed they had to defeat the Grand Duke so that the chain of command over the other monsters could be broken. Will had a plan, but he didn't have the authority to decide because he was just an ordinary person without magic. However, Wignall, Colette, and Scion were ready to follow his plan. Liana would also entrust all decisions to him because Will was more suitable to be their leader. The first thing Will did was to teach Julius a secret trick of Elfaria's magic. The ice clone spell could continue the spell incantation even if the clone was destroyed, allowing another clone to continue the incantation, so Julius could activate a powerful, long-cast spell. Thanks to Will's guidance, Julius was able to use his signature magic. However, since the monster was still persistent, Liana was deployed to finish it off. With her lightning-fast maneuvers, Liana had to break through to destroy the monster's core. Unfortunately, the plan failed because the enemy had placed a shield around the monster, making it difficult to penetrate. Before the monster could counterattack, Will quickly protected Liana. To make up for her mistake, Liana would buy time so that her friends could escape. With Wignall by her side, Liana continued to fight the monster until she was exhausted. While Sion was considering what to do, Will suddenly asked to be hit because he was scared and trembling since the glasses given to him by Elfaria were broken. With anger, Sion fulfilled his request and hit Will. After being hit by him, Will was able to get up and face the monster again. However, because of the monster's agile movements, Will had difficulty attacking it. The only way to win was to cut off its wings to limit the monster's movement. Then, as Will jumped, Colette created a giant sword with her magic. With that sword, she immediately slashed the monster's wings. Wing was cut off. Sion started moving and launched a close-range fire spell. However, that still wasn't enough to defeat it. When they were at their wits' end, Rossi secretly threw something to Will. That object allowed Will to use his power to concentrate magic into his sword. When using that sword, Will's mind suddenly went blank and unconsciously, he used his sword to absorb Sion's magic. With the magic-powered sword, Will felt an immense surge of power. He then ran towards the Grand Duke, deflecting all the monster's attacks and successfully approaching the terrifying creature, and successfully defeated the Grand Duke with a single slash. The strongest monster was finally defeated, but its cry alerted the other monsters to come and surround them. Mr. Workner and Edward had been watching them from a distance. However, they couldn't save them because the distance was too far. Just as the monsters were about to attack, a wizard suddenly came to their rescue. The wizard slaughtered all the monsters with a mass destruction spell. It turned out that the wizard was Aaron Masterius, a Magia Vander king, nicknamed the strongest wizard. While everyone else was focused on the king, Will's gaze was only on the young man carrying the belongings. The young man approached him and introduced himself as Finn. This unusual exploration activity resulted in 11 casualties. All the victims were professors or instructors who were overseeing the practice. According to witnesses, the perpetrator was among the search party, but there were no clues at all about his whereabouts. While in the recovery room, Liana said that this team was amazing. As a low-ranking knight, she thanked them. After saying that, her stomach suddenly growled, realizing Liana was hungry. Colette immediately approached to feed her. At the same time, Sion asked Will about the power he used when he absorbed his magic. Regarding his power, Will didn't know either, so he couldn't explain it because his mind was blank at that time. That night, Finn met the headmaster. After conducting the expedition with the king, Finn gave the found weapon for further analysis. In addition, Finn also asked the headmaster why he hid Will from him. After all, swordsmen were Finn's responsibility. Carefully, the headmaster explained that Will was one of his students and he wanted to become a wizard to become a Magia Vander. Hearing this, Finn was confused by Will's decision to become a wizard even though he was a great swordsman. But the headmaster assured him that this was also to protect humanity from unknown threats from the sky. The next day, Will returned to practice in the schoolyard even though he wasn't fully recovered. Feeling unwilling to lose, Sion forced him to continue their previous fight. Will accepted his challenge, but they couldn't fight seriously because they were caught and forbidden by their teacher. After that, the academy students would face their final exam, which would determine their future. Will would try his best to pass the exam and achieve his goal of standing beside Elfaria.